Welcome back to the class. So we are continuing with the discussion on Marxian theory on capitalism. So as we discussed in the previous classes, the contribution of Karl Marx on different aspects of social theory is quite enormous. He was a sociologist, he was a philosopher, he was a political scientist. But Karl Marx is widely known for his very original and very, very influential contribution to the science of economics. And especially his analysis about capitalism was quite revolutionary, it was quite controversial, it was quite influential. At the same time, it was controversial. And we started this discussion on Marxian argument about capitalism in the previous session, and today's class is a continuation of the previous session. So we discussed in the previous class that Marxian analysis of capitalism, where he understands capitalism as a necessary stage or as even as a welcoming stage in the mode of production from that of pre-capitalist or feudal era into a new mode. And while he welcomes that, he also understands that this is an extremely exploitative phase which would eventually die out. So he understands capitalism as a transient period, as an intermediary period, which would eventually lead to that of socialism, and after that, that situation of a communism, where a classless society would be heralded. So we saw in the previous class how he looks at this the labor or the labor power of the working class as central to his theory on capitalism. So we are continuing with that discussion. So in the capitalist production, Marx's analysis of capitalism shift the primary focus from the sphere of exchange to the sphere of production, from the market dynamics to that of the labor process. So this is a very important point, because unlike quite a lot of later economists, he identified the site in which the profit is realized or profit is created is not that of the market, but it is within the factory, it is within the sphere of production, and that was his argument. So the question of secret of profit making, where does profit come from? From the previous section we discussed, in the previous session we discussed how Marx understands, or Marx explains this whole industrial form of production, the centrality of laborers, and how their labor is something quite unique. It cannot be compared with other aspects of means of production like your technology or raw materials or anything. This is something quite unique. So in this particular section, this current class, we will discuss his arguments about how profit is realized, and how capitalism has its own set of contradictions which Marx believed will lead to a complete system of its collapse, leading to that of a new mode of production. So while the purchase of labor power takes place in the market, its consumption, the real appropriation of someone else's living labor, takes place in the actual production process. So this is what he emphasizes again and again. The actual site in which profit is produced is actually the site of production. It is the actual production process. In return for their promise to pay a wage, capitalists acquire ownership of workers' labor power for a stipulated period of time. This, Marx emphasizes, confers invaluable prerogative, the right of property. Workers pay a heavy price when they hire themselves out to capitalists. So here he is explaining why that the workers' labor power in an industrial setting or in a capital system is inherently exploited. Marx argues that when they pay a heavy price when they hire themselves out to capitalists, they are compelled to cede control over both their labor power and the products of their labor. So this particular point, he analyzes it in multiple dimensions. This he understands it as a very essential feature of the exploitative nature of capitalism. This also he analyzes in a much more philosophical point of view, where he understands this particular aspect, where the workers lose control over both their labor power and the products of their labor. Marx identifies this as a very, very important aspect of their alienation. And he rejects the view that profits arise from the capitalists selling commodities at a price higher than their value. And this is again very much against the conventional understanding in economics, where the capitalists sell things at a much higher price and then create profit. But he says that this has a limit; it cannot go beyond a point. So Marx has a different explanation. The exchange of commodities does not, in itself, Marx asserts, create value. Profit is only realized through the sale of commodities in the market. It is produced in the process of production, something that we discussed, we mentioned some time back. Profit is only realized through sale of commodities in the market. You realize, you actually get that profit when you sell a particular commodity in the market, but it is produced, the very profit is produced at the time of production. And in order to understand that, you have to really understand the dynamics of the production per se. So capitalists purchase two sorts of commodities with their original investment, the means of production, including the machinery and raw materials, and the labor power. This is something that we discussed already, that these two things really form the means of production, and similar means of productions are prevalent, or they exist in the previous means of production, like that of slavery or feudalism and similar means of production. So Marx's key point here is that while machinery imparts value equivalent to its depreciation, it does not create value, because the value of this part of capital remains the same throughout the process of production. Marx refers this to as a constant capital. While these raw materials, machinery, these things are important, he calls them as constant capital. They do not create, while they can actually depreciate. So he calls them it as a constant capital. While the more significant type of capital, or the most significant type of component involved in the forms of production is that of the labor power, as Marxian argued. So labor power, on the other hand, both produces the equivalent of its own value and produce an excess. And this is his key point, where he brings in his argument on surplus value. So only the labor power has the ability to produce, to reproduce its equivalent of its own value and also produce an excess. The human labor expanded in the production of the final product thus takes two distinct forms. First, the past or dead labor congealed in the means of production and passed on to the new commodity. And second, living labor, the labor power in action, which preserves the existing value of the original capital outlay and add new value as well. So he understands this labor power has these two dimensions. One has a regenerative capacity, the other one is capable of producing the existing value. So he argues workers are paid according to their value, but there is a difference between the value of labor power, that is the cost required for the reproduction of the worker. Reproduction of the worker both in his physical sense as well as in his social sense. Remember the discussion that we had in the previous class about what does it mean to be the reproduction of a worker. So the worker needs to be replenished. He is a social being, so that person must be able to reproduce himself both in social as well as physical as well as economic sense. And the value labor power creates. So the cost required for the reproduction of the worker is much lower than the actual value that a laborer creates. And this excess value that the laborer creates during this process of production is appropriated by the capitalist, argues Karl Marx. The wealth of workers produce, in other words, is greater than the wealth needed to sustain them. This is the secret of profit making. So he would argue that the wealth that the workers produce is much more than what is required to sustain them, and this excess work is actually taken by the capitalists, and that is what is the secret of profit making. Workers are paid the full value of their labor power, but they are not paid full value of their labor, because it is much more than what is being compensated. They are not paid the equivalent of what they produce. The reality is that the purchasing labor power, they gain command of the worker's capacity to labor for a period of time in excess of what is necessary for the worker to produce the equivalent of their social subsistence wage. The same point. What the more you compel the workers to work more, the amount of work that they produce, the value of the labor power is much more than what they are actually compensated for. The fact that half a day's labor is necessary to keep the workers alive during 24 hours does not in any way prevent them from working a whole day. Marx calls the second portion of the working day as surplus labor time. This is from the surplus or unpaid labor that capitalists derive their profit. Yeah, so ultimately he argues that the capitalist class appropriates surplus value through the exploitation of the working class. And this is the central thesis of Marxian argument, because he understands, or he argues, or this was his project, his intellectual project, to show that capitalism is nothing but the exploitation of the working class. So driving motive and determining purpose of the capitalist system, Marx states, is the greatest possible production of surplus value, hence the greatest possible exploitation of labor power. The rate of exploitation is a rate of surplus labor to necessary labor. Okay? So this is the central tenet, or this is the central argument of Marx, that within capitalism, profit is made, or profit is created by exploiting the workers. Because in the typical capitalist form, the worker is not adequately compensated. Workers compelled to sell their labor power in the marketplace are then drafted into the army of wage laborers under the capitalist command and subjected to barrack-like discipline of the workplace. And this is something has produced quite a lot of very interesting work. How did this emergence of capitalism really regimented the lives of people? I have mentioned it in one of the previous sessions. The factory system, the sound of the siren, the very specific regimented production schedules, very determined intervals, very specific forms of intervals. So everything is regimented, everything is disciplined. There is a major surveillance system that looks at each and every action of an individual. So this was something quite unusual. This was something quite unprecedented in the history of human life. So this creates a kind of a barrack-like discipline of the worker. Capitalists are at war against time. It is its insatiable appetite for surplus labor, Marx says. Capital usurps the time for growth, development, and healthy maintenance of the body. It steals the time required for the consumption of fresh air and sunlight. It haggles over the meal time, where possible, incorporating them into production process itself. So he says that capitalists are at war against time. It has an insatiable appetite for surplus labor. And Marx says capital usurps the time for growth, development, and healthy maintenance of the body. And I again invite your attention to the film by Charlie Chaplin. It steals the time required for the consumption of fresh air and sunlight. It haggles over the meal time, where possible, incorporating them into the production process itself. So we know that the kind of achievement of labor class, that 8 hours of work, this particular thing was an achievement in every sense of the word, because the workers across the globe had really fought very hard battles to get this granted from, say, 12 hours of working period or even more than that. So he argues that capitalism has an inherent tendency to extend the working hours, because only through that they are able to realize profit. Capitalism, Marx concludes, surpasses all other systems of production in its energy and quality, unbounded and ruthless activity. Now, what are the contradictions and the crisis tendencies? We know that Marx argued that capitalism is only a transient phase. It's only an intermediary phase between feudalism and that of communism. He welcomed it. He understood that it is far better compared to that of the previous sessions, previous phases. But he argued that the capitalism has its own seeds of destruction. It has its own elements of contradiction, and it will end up in crisis before and then ultimately lead to the revolution. So let us examine how Marx argues about this kind of a capitalist contradictions and crisis tendencies. Even as it reproduces itself, capitalism never stays the same. It is always changing and expanding, and even as it persists, capitalism is inherently crisis-prone, susceptible to periodic breakdown. So capitalists, in response to the coercive laws of competition, are constantly pressured to increasing efficiency and productivity. As one capitalist cheapens the cost of production by introducing labor-saving technologies, others are compelled to follow suit. We know about the kind of ruthless competition that exists among the capitalists. So they are competing with each other in order to bring down the cost of production, and mostly this is done by introducing labor-saving technologies, and others are compelled to follow the suit. But that results in an overall decline of profit. You know that it's not always easy to do that, being excessively competitive, because it actually brings down the profit. So as machinery is increasingly substituted for labor in the process of production, as technology is called upon to do more and more of the work, the amount of living labor time embodied in commodities shrink. But since living labor or the variable capital is the source of profit, the inner logic of the capitalist development engages a progressive tendency for the general rate of profit to fall. So Marx is actually explaining how there are stages of growth and then fall, growth and decline in the capitalist economy. How this is an inherent inbuilt system in that, because once you enter into a phase of fierce competition with others, then your profit is bound to fall. Now, when the decline of the rate of profit becomes sufficiently serious, an economic crisis erupts. Less profitable industries are forced out of business, investments and productions are curtailed, unemployment increases, and the industrial reserve army grows. And this is another very important term that we discussed in the previous class, how this industrial reserve army emerges. The eventual effect of such regularly occurring catastrophes, by causing the destruction of less productive enterprises and the decline of wages, is to restore, at least temporarily, the condition for the profitable investment. Stagnation in production, Marx states, prepare for the ground for a later expansion of production. So he's talking about the kind of cycles of increased competition and then profit making, and the stagnation and the decline, and which again actually goes up. Now, as this boom and bust cycle continues, he explains, crisis becomes progressively more frequent and severe, not only hindering capitalism's ability to recover, but also threatening its violent overthrow. The emergence of class consciousness, class polarization, and ultimately the revolution. So this is what Marx argues, that capitalism will have to face this frequent crisis and then development, followed by another crisis and then development, and this will finally lead to the points that we discussed in the previous class about the emergence of class consciousness. The workers realize that they have a historical obligation to uphold the politics of the working class, and they have this historical obligation to overthrow the system of capitalism and lead to class polarization, a class in itself to class for itself, the development of class consciousness, and ultimately the overthrow of capitalism through a revolution. So capitalism is susceptible to crisis, Marx argues, because of its unlimited ambition, its need for unceasing expansion and endless profit making. So this again, we discussed how this profit making, creation of capital for the sake of creating further capital is something quite unique to capitalism. The imperative, accumulate, inevitably comes into conflict with the limits imposed by the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses. This is yet another prophecy of Marx which did not come true. While the masses remain poor, the capitalism itself really invented ways of expanding the needs of human beings. We know how the kind of overconsumption or excessive consumption has become a norm in the world. So capitalism is vulnerable to breakdown because of its intrinsically contradictory nature. It has its own seeds of destruction, as we discussed. And this is again goes back to the Marxian dialectics, where he applies the Hegelian dialectics into the material condition. Marx viewed capitalism as playing a historically progressive role, unwittingly preparing the way for the socialist society and future. So here we will spend some time trying to understand the Marxian take on capitalism. Okay? What were the kind of points, or what were the important contributions of Marx on capitalism, and what were the points that he was right, and what were the points in which he was kind of wrong. Marx viewed capitalism as playing a historically progressive role, unwittingly preparing the way for the socialist society of the future, which is a point that we have repeatedly discussed. For Marx, capitalism was a modernizing force that would usher in modern nation state, bourgeoisie middle class, civil society, technological advancements, liberalism, and so on. So definitely he understood capitalism as something far more favorable, something far more acceptable, even desirable compared to that of feudalism and slavery. Because here, at least you are able to talk about individual, you are able to talk about a nation state, you are able to talk about a emergence of a middle class, a civil society, technological advancements, and liberal ideas, the rights of human beings, whether it's individual rights or human rights, or such more advanced and nuanced ideas of existence is possible only in a capitalist era. In the Communist Manifesto, he and Engels assert that what distinguishes capitalist epoch from all others is the constant revolutionizing of production, the uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, and the experience of everlasting uncertainty and agitation. The modern capitalist world is one of permanent change, where all that is solid melts into air. So in the Communist Manifesto, he and Engels assert that what distinguishes capitalist epoch from all others is the constant revolutionizing of production, because this is the most dynamic phase in the human history. We never had this much of innovations coming into picture, this much of discoveries coming into picture, this much of very rapid social transformation taking place. The uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions and the experience of everlasting uncertainty and agitation. Okay? Everything that is stagnant is being questioned. Everything that was very, very strongly, believed in, every strong convictions are being questioned. The modern capitalist world is one of permanent change, where all that is solid melts into air. This again is a very important quotation by quote by Karl Marx. Now, Marx says that capitalism in just a single century has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than all preceding generations together, and hence a great transformative force. The same point that we discussed, why that he considers it as a very defining moment in the human history. It has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than having all preceding generations together. And he predicted an uprising of the proletariat, a revolution, and the ultimate overthrow of the system of capitalism, which we know that did not come true. But this prediction did not come true. No major socialist revolutions in any of the capitalist nations and capitalism appear as most enduring economic system. At least till the fall of Soviet Union in 1990, there was some kind of a debate whether are we seeing two competing types of economic system, the socialism and or the communism and capitalism. But with the fall of Berlin Wall and the fall of USSR, the world has moved into a unipolar world system, and capitalism has been widely heralded or being widely accepted as the only thriving economic mode. Even the namesake communist countries like say China, they have completely embraced capitalism, and we'll have to really have a very long debate about what means to be communism in its economic sense in China. So this is a place where the Marxian arguments about the fall of capitalism as an economic system did not come true, and there are a host of reasons for that. There are quite a lot of arguments. A lot of economists have argued about the kind of shortcomings in Marxian analysis about capitalism. And of course, we need to understand that capitalism as an economic system was in its very beginning stages. It was in its very nascent stage during Marxian time, and the capitalism evolved over significantly since Marxian time. Marx presents a very oversimplistic picture of bourgeoisie and proletariat, and he identified proletariat as the actual agents of social change by even neglecting other people like, say, agriculturalists or middle class or artisans and other sections. So the very character of capitalism has changed. Marx does not really talk much about the kind of an intermediary managerial class, which actually act as a buffer zone between the bourgeoisie and the laborers. Then, of course, the very character of private ownership change. You have share market comes into picture. The public can buy the shares, so you don't have this old classical idea of a bourgeoisie as a single owner of the factory who holds of the who has all the money together, money who monopolizes over this money. That character of capitalism is completely changed. And of course, more recently now there are quite a lot of companies who dole out their shares to their own employees. So making more profit is now become the interest of the workers as. So here the Marxian model of capitalism no longer works. Of course, you can talk about exploitation and other things, but the whole dynamics is completely changed. So the appearance of a gigantic multinational corporations, which did not exist during Marxian time, the rise of welfare state and extension of citizenship rights, okay, especially in Western Europe, the welfare state became important, labor laws became important, labor union became important, and the kind of extreme form of exploitation, at least in the developed societies, is much lesser. Workers are more organized, they are paid well compared to many other places. The appearance of a pervasive mass media industry and a culture of consumerism, okay, our needs are reinvented every time. The kind of a connection between the greed, our needs, and the kind of a consumer society. The shift from manufacturing industries to service industries, where this entire process of production undergoes change. It's no longer on the factory floors. It's mostly in in air-conditioned rooms. The idea of a proletariat underwent significantly changed. It is no longer the blue-collar workers who toil very hard in very inhuman situation. It's more of executives. It's more of professionals. And the emergence of new social movements focused on issues of gender, race, nationality, sexual identity, and environment, and many other causes. When you look at that from, say, 1970s onwards, when you talk about the new social movement or a host of other identity-related issues have come to the fore, even pushing back the conventional class-oriented concerns to the back seat. Now, we know that there is a realization that this term proletariat does not represent everybody. The workers of the world, they don't really share common set of issues. But there are, other than their working class identity, there are a host of other issues related to identities, which are even more important. And we know that, for example, in India, caste is an extremely important identity, and which a typical Marxian explanation will not be able to understand and explain. Gender, where Marxian analysis is very much limited. So is the case with sexual identity, or environmental issue, racism. So there were a plethora of identity-related issues, and mobilization took place from 1960s and 70s onwards, which actually came to the fore by pushing back this class-based mobilization to the back. And ultimately, what we see is the resilience of the capitalist system. Its ability to tide over every crisis, its ability to survive, its ability to adapt itself to the changing situations. And though we say that capitalism might face challenges, there is absolutely no idea about what would be, whether it will lead to a kind of a complete collapse and a completely new system of or new mode of production will come into picture. We have there's absolutely no dependable evidence to even to think so. So the revolution, it remains a wishful thinking of some diehard communists who think of a revolution uprising of the workers. It only remains this kind of a wishful thinking, whereas the world has moved forward. So we will stop the discussion here, and we'll continue with the discussion on Marx in the coming class with a different topic. Thank you.